Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 116 Bad Assumptions about Machine Embroidery. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome into the Take Up. I'm happy to have you here on this Education Friday to talk a little bit about some things that come up over and over again in the world of machine embroidery, apparel decoration, business, and the like. Certainly, we're going to talk a lot about embroidery. There'll be some stuff that's more universal, but throughout this, we're just going to be talking about the kinds of things that people assume about the business, about doing work in the business, about embroidery machines, about digitizing that hang them up, that cause problems, that make them miss things, that honestly also just cause them some pain because they're making assumptions that don't make sense. So hopefully we'll be able to make this something that's fun and nice to discuss. We will try and be nice to the people who have some of these assumptions and hopefully help you from falling into some pitfalls. One of the most watched videos I have ever shared is my one about digitizing pitfalls. Hopefully some of these will be a little bit more generic. We have some different categories about like machines and execution, certainly about digitizing and going further into things like business, like assumptions people have about us as embroiderers. Today, I have a hard out. The show cannot be too long, so I'll have to head out a little bit early, have something going on with the family that I absolutely must attend to today. But we will discuss as much as we can. This might be a multi part show. However, what I'm going to promise you ahead of time for those of you who are here to see me do digitizing content, you want to see more art interpretation, straight digitizing content, how to's, execution. Next week is a full digitizing show. So I'm saying this ahead of time before next week comes. At the beginning of this show, next week, I'm going to be talking about achieving certain effects with digitizing and talking about what to do with logos that have destruction, distortion, and other sorts of distress. So we're going to talk about that among possibly a couple other topics because it may not be enough for the full session. So next week, full on artistic digitizing interpretation. That's what we're doing this week. A little bit more of talking about the business itself, doing the business. And like I said, the things that we assume about being in the business of embroidery, the things we assume about doing digitizing and interpretation and art, the things we assume about our embroidery machines that can trip us up, especially at the beginning. But I will say this: there are some of these things that people continue to believe and hold on to that hold them up, that slow them down throughout the process, throughout their career in embroidery and in apparel decoration. Why am I able to do this? Over 20 plus years of talking about this stuff and doing this stuff, I have been around, I have consulted with people, I have helped people on so many subjects. And when I have done so, a lot of them fall under these same categories. These assumptions that people make that cause them to get hung up, that cause them to have problems. So, like I said, we're going to talk about that stuff a little bit more generic today, a little bit more around the entire sphere. Next week, definitely in on digitizing art interpretation and that. So if that's what you're here for more than the business, the analysis, the rest of it, then no worries. Jump in next week. We'll have more of that. Today, we're going to have a little bit more about the big pitfalls people find themselves in. I'm going to say hello to a couple of people who are here. By the way, if you have questions, things that you assumed that turned out not to be right, things that tripped you up in the beginning that you would like to share or help people avoid, jump in the comments and share them. I would love to share your experiences too while we're on this subject. But let me say hi to a couple folks, and then I'll start kind of defining some terms and talking about what it is we're here to discuss, the things that trip people up. So let's talk about that. But first, let's say hi to a couple folks real quick. First, we have Barb in, and she says, "Good afternoon, everyone from North Central Minnesota." And hi, Eric. Well, hi, Barb. Happy to have you in. We have Mike Muldowney, who was here earlier trying to get songs stuck in my head. So he says, "Hey ho, no mo." You're right. I've had the Ramones stuck in my head all day long since you said "hey ho" this morning, Mike. But hey, happy to have an earworm that's at least some music I occasionally will like. So that's always good. Brian, creator of Brilliance, Brian Bailey, is here saying happy Friday. Happy Friday to you, Brian. Happy to see you here. And Bob says, "Hey now." So, hey now, Bob. Happy to have you in as well. Kenneth is here. Hi, Kenneth. And Brian says, got a comment already. With costs rising and belts tightening, it's worth looking at ways to build the businesses. Yes. And what I'm going to say is more and more people, more and more embroiderers, and including craft embroiderers. If you're here and you are a craft art embroiderer, if you are here on that side, so many more of you are realizing that you have a machine capable of some production in your house and you may have something you want to sell. Because the other thing I'm going to say ahead of time, despite the fact that I was absolutely a business to business commercial guy, I'm not the guy who's going to look down their nose at the craft table. People who are selling at the craft table are still doing business and still, honestly, sadly, stuck with some of these assumptions that cause problems. When we're all here kind of dealing with a little bit of extra cash that we have to make up, I know that a lot of you folks, even the arts and crafts folks, are jumping out saying, hey, I can make a couple hundred extra bucks this month and make my life a little easier. There's some assumptions that you might make that are going to make that harder for you too. So this may still be a topic for everybody. And I agree with Brian. We should all be looking at ways to build the business. Justa's in here from Sweden. Justa, happy to see you here. Justin's here. Hello, hello. Hi, Justin. Happy to have you in. Pam says, hey, Eric, you always have good info. Thank you, Pam. Happy to hear that. I'm happy that you like the info, and hopefully we'll have some good stuff today. If nothing else, today's got some head scratchers for people to consider for sure. Mike says, yes, indeed. If the pies my fingers are in are shrinking, get more pies. Yeah, for sure. I cannot tell you how much people are forgetting the primary thing. In fact, here's an assumption that I'm going to tell you right off the top from business, and this is outside of the realm entirely of just embroidery. This is in every business. One of the things that people cause problems with for themselves all the time is thinking of marketing as a cost that's not building back in. We have a downturn economically, things start going bad in sales, and then they stop selling, they stop marketing, pull back on their marketing budget, pull back on the time spent messaging, and they end up with fewer jobs coming in. What Mike is saying here also kind of goes to what happened during the pandemic, where people started looking for other kind of places that we could kind of move our production to. People who are in other kinds of printing started doing floor signage when people stopped doing promotional products. So 100% people are able to make more than they think they can. And honestly, in the business side of this thing, way too often people get really bound up in the technical nature of executing embroidery. That's my thing, what I love, but they forget that marketing and also looking for other markets, looking for niches that you can sell into is so critical, is so important. So yeah, don't pull back. Don't pull back when we have a little downturn. Lean into selling, lean into acquiring jobs, because no matter what you're doing right now, yes, you need to keep your production moving. Yes, you need to keep those needles moving. But if you don't keep the jobs coming, if you don't keep the hopper full of jobs going into production, the chances are you're going to end up with an even sharper downturn later. So yeah, one of the big assumptions I didn't even write down for today is that pulling back on your marketing is a good way to save money. Almost always a bad way to save money. Just going to say it. I've watched this happen over and over since the era of the Yellow Pages ad. Let's talk about how long that is. Lindsay saying, hi, Eric. Hi, Lindsay. And always glad to see you here. You are busy doing all kinds of great work. Joey says hello. Hello, Joey. Christine Shreve also helping, also out there with Lindsay doing great work. Hey, Eric, thought I would stop by. Happy to have you in. Justin says, if there's extra money laying around somewhere, let me know. I will say this much. There's probably more out there than people know if they are willing to go and attack it and get it. Christine says, totally agree with that. Marketing is so important and it gets neglected in favor of other things. Absolutely. I will say this. You definitely, everybody kind of talks about, you miss all the shots you don't take. That's the Gretzky quote that everybody kind of mangles, that I just mangled again. But the truth of the matter is, if you can't get yourself in front of people, there's no chance for them to buy. Yes, people are buying less, but if you are not able to get in front of people, or if you don't try to get in front of people, they don't even know you're selling in the first place. You can't do business if you don't market and message, flat out. So we'll get further into digitizing embroidery stuff in a second, because I absolutely think it's useful and worthwhile. But it is absolutely something that everyone forgets when we have, especially economic downturns like this. We have inflation acting up. Looking for the places where we can get those additional jobs, not backing off on marketing, and honestly, looking at capacity you have that you're not using is worthwhile right now. Especially if you have downtime. If you slow down and you have downtime, downtime is the time to strike out, to message, to market, and to look for the capacity you have, and honestly, to work on efficiencies to some degree. But definitely, you got to be getting that stuff coming back in. And yeah, Christine says that. Yeah, marketing is so important and neglected in favor of other things. Absolutely. Happens all the time. People stop marketing because it feels like a cost, but it's not an excessive cost. Plus, it brings things back. You have to look at the return on that investment. And Mike says, I found some in my backlog. Yeah, get those jobs out and build, people. That's always a good way to go. And Frank out in the UK says, good evening, all. Thank you, Frank, for being an awesome supporter of the community and sharing everybody's message. He has been absolutely out there sharing all of the different education, so that not only all of us who do education have audiences, but all the audiences have education to watch and to learn from. So thank you, Frank, for being an awesome member of the community. With that, let's start into the topic. Like I said, shorter show today. I know you guys are always saying, "Oh, you're not gonna be a short show." I actually have to head out today. I have something I must do, so I'll be a little shorter than usual. I'll be a little tighter than usual as soon as I get my notifications. But I'm going to say this much: we are going to start into this one with a couple of things that I talk about repeatedly that are off the beat. You guys remember I talked about the principle of charity and the principle of humanity? I'm going to define them one more time because here's the thing. We know people have bad assumptions. Why did I put that on the on the initial thumbnail for this? Why is there the little scare quote about little parentheses actually in here that says bad assumptions? Because truthfully, some of these assumptions aren't bad, but they can have bad results. And I don't want to say that people who are coming from these places that they've made some assumptions about what's going to happen when they start decorating are bad people, are stupid people, are ignorant. Uh, if nothing else, you might just not know. You just don't know yet. You might not be entirely immersed in the world of apparel decoration, so you make some assumptions based on things you do know. And so, what I'd like to say is before we say any of this stuff, I'm not poking fun. We all started from somewhere. Principle of charity: if someone gives me one of these assumptions, I'm going to take the best version of that assumption I can and talk about it when I argue. Principle of humanity: I'm going to assume that if I had the same background that they did, that I might think the same thing they do, make the same choices they did. But I'm still going to go at it from the point of view of the experience I have and share with you guys how I feel about some of these assumptions and the things that I've noticed over my years of both being in the industry and consulting with people who are. So that's one of those things you just kind of have to look at. You absolutely have to deal with that stuff. By the way, folks, uh, pushing all my own buttons today, as per the usual. You never know when there might be issues with that kind of stuff. So I do apologize. We have a couple of weird comments going on, stuff like that. We will deal with those as best we can. All right. So Facebook user, I think that's you out in Santa Fe, 100 degrees in Carlsbad. Oh, no, maybe not. Another New Mexican who is in with us, Brian says, level cash flow requires that you market more when times are slow. If it feels backwards, but it's the way to do it. Brian knows. Brian has a business that has been thriving for some time. You better understand that he does know this stuff very well. Curtis says, hello, Curtis. Happy to have you in as well. All right. So let's go ahead and get into it. So, like I said, principle of charity. If somebody comes to you with one of these assumptions, don't argue with them like they're crazy. Argue the best version of it. Principle of humanity: know that they might make the same kind of questions and things that might happen. So yeah, sincerely. And Christine, giving me a little bit of grace here, says, pushing your own buttons is tricky. I do that every week, and it can get distracting. Yeah, no, totally, that can happen, and especially if we're having issues with things like, let's say, StreamYard not working the way it probably should. Yeah, that can happen. We're having some issues with StreamYard today where it's not acting right with the comments. So, hey, forgive me if there's some weird comments. I will delete them down the road. All right, so let's get into it. First thing I'm going to say is this. One of the things that causes all these assumptions, because we have, like I said, I'm going to start with the execution and machinery assumptions that people come to. But one of the things that causes this stuff is that people forget to think of things in context. I'm going to say this repeatedly throughout this today. There are problems with context. If you aren't thinking about your specific business and the way your business works rather than just the way any business works, you're going to have problems. The context changes depending on who you are and what's going on. It's like, quite sincerely, um, every business is different, every market is different, and wherever these people are who are working toward things that have these different kind of assumptions, they may be looking at a different context. If they're being told kind of by committee in a group that there's a bunch of people who are doing pricing a certain way, who are buying machines for a certain reason, but it doesn't match with what they're doing, they can have issues. If you're a complete business to business shop and all you do is business to business work, or you do work that is essentially contract work, your context is very, very different from someone who's doing bridal work or gift work or resort wear or on site decoration. And all of these are places where embroidery can thrive. So context is a big deal. If you don't know your context, you're going to have problems. The biggest thing I see with context issues, and we'll talk about this further on in the business section, is about pricing. Lots of people with single head machines think that they are going to essentially be able to price the same way that a large contract shop does. Large contract shops don't operate on the same scale that a single head shop does. And if you try and match pricing and execution and method of business with a larger contract shop that has 100 heads, or heck, even 48 heads, and you only have a single head, prepare yourself for the worst. You may have problems because you're making choices about the wrong context. And the other way I kind of like to try and bring this back and make it make sense is you have to think of it in the way of fitness. And I mean this in kind of the evolutionary sense of fitness. What fits the best for your world, the world you live in, the equipment you have, the people to whom you are selling, the market you serve? This has to be considered, especially when people are doing things like saying pricing and, you know, $1 per thousand is the big one, which I'm going to talk about later, where someone always gives you this flat rate pricing, or they price by committee. They look at a bunch of people who are kind of near their area or somewhere around where people are in their same market. They take everybody's prices, average them, and then go to the bargain with that, go to the bargain basement underneath them and try and use that to be a way to scoop out some business out from under someone. And in that context, they're not thinking of what fits for them. And even at those rates, or especially at those rates, when someone else has higher efficiency, they may be cutting their own throats. They may be causing their business irreparable damage by trying to sell to the wrong people, by trying to sell the wrong way. The other thing that can happen, we're talking about digitizing and art and preparation for other kinds of execution. Let's say somebody comes from another background, they've done some other kind of graphic art, they've done some other kind of decoration, they get into embroidery, and they have this sense of a false universality. And what I mean by that is that they think that the way that you handle art, the way that you handle things for print or for digital reproduction or for even for screen print, that there's going to be a fairly simple way to convert or move from that kind of method to embroidery without having to think about materials, without having to think about the medium. And of the mediums I've worked in this industry, and certainly I've spent most of my time with embroidery, done a fair amount of sublimation, done a fair amount of vinyl cutting and heat transfer. Embroidery by far has the most variation that I've had to deal with and the most difficulty for people to adjust to the medium. This kind of idea that it's going to be universal and that there won't be any problems. I know how to do art. I know how to prep. I can print a t-shirt with whatever method, means I'll be able to embroider a shirt in the same way, causes problems. I mean, don't get me wrong. We can also have the same problem with as embroiderers where we feel like because we do something that has so much variation and difficulty that printing is going to be simple to us. But if we've never done art prep for print, we can have issues with things like color management or other sorts of, sequencing and layering of colors that work differently for print than work for stitching, that it has and nothing to do with what we do in embroidery, and we can have the same kind of problems. So like I said, it's not that it's something that anyone is doing in a bad way. We're not in a negative sense here. We're not trying to call somebody out, but there is this sense of false universality. Like I have skills that are going to translate from one side to the other, and they don't always translate, or they're not the critical thing that makes the difference. They're not the thing that needs specific skill or that has a lot of technical basis behind it that people have to know in order to get things done. So yeah, that's another one of the things that really cause those issues. So what we find is when I'm talking about most of these things, most of these assumptions, as we get into them, the likelihood is the decisions aren't just black and white. What we're usually doing is saying, all right, I'm looking at my context, where I live, what I want to do, who I'm selling to, and then I want to look at the pros and cons of of this choice that I might be making, of this assumption that I've made, and what choices that influences. And I'm going to say, all right, in that context, does this make sense for me, being who I am, serving who I do, with what equipment I have or intend to get? Does it make sense to me? Will this actually make a difference? And you have to do a little bit more research than you might think. You actually have to think about context. You have to think about fitness. And most certainly, that means evaluating the pros and cons based on who you are, what you want to do, and what you intend your business to look like. If you have no idea about that, it's kind of like the old marketing statement where somebody says, "Okay, who's your ideal customer?" And somebody says, "All customers," because what they want is just to make as much money as possible. All customers isn't a target, and also any shop is not really a shop I can tell you how to run. It's not the same shop. Like I said, there are lots of different reasons why you make some choices. And I'm even going to talk about some choices here that you think are cut and dry. Trust me. Even I thought they were cut and dry. But as soon as you have some perspective on why people make different decisions, you might think, hey, there are reasons why you might make a different decision if you were in the position of the person making that decision. It was different context. Context is everything with this stuff. So there will be some things we talk about. I will show some slides and some other info as we get through here, but let's just start in. Let's talk about it. So what I want to first kind of get into is kind of the hardware version of this, the machines and production side. choices that we would make about our machines, choices we would make about production, and why they matter. And like I said, I have tons of these. We will probably not cover all this list. There may be a part 2 and a part 3 down the road, but that's what we're going to start with, is machines in production. But first, let me go ahead and get a couple comments, because we have a couple of comments that are here to try to deal with that. Number one, Justin making fun of my comment problem, saying, "Here's my chance to write weird comments, please." Go ahead. It's a lot better than what I got. For some reason, I'm going to be honest with you guys. StreamYard usually lets us ban and kick people with comments. For some reason, I've got somebody in here who I can't ban and kick, and whatever, I'm having some issues with that channel. I will be ending that channel if that's what keeps happening. Mike says, yeah, the worst place to spam. Don't spam here, because no one's listening. We're all here learning the best. Eddie Jr. says, what's good? What's good, Eddie? Happy to have you in. Lyndon says, happy Friday. Happy Father's Day to the dads. Yeah, happy Father's Day, all you dads. Brian says, what? Embroidery is not TTG, thread to garment? No, it is not. It is not direct printing. And we're actually going to say, that's my first statement I'm going to make here shortly. And Christine says, thank you for saying that. I always tell everyone when I do a seminar about marketing or pricing that finding a target market, that no one's target market is everyone. Well, here's the thing. You can serve everyone. You can't market to everyone. The shops that I came from were one-stop shops, and I'm actually going to talk about the universality of shops and what that matters. How does that work for people? The pros and cons there. I worked at one-stop shops, and we did everything from the retail on, constantly. We did everything from business to business, which was our primary, out to retail, to resort wear. We did a little bit of everything, but we had strengths and we had markets that we marketed to. And we also had individual brands, which I might also talk about a little bit, touch on when we talk about business models. We had individual brands that weren't the same as the main brand. It doesn't mean you can't embroider for everyone. It means you can't really write a marketing pitch or a campaign and have it address everyone's needs. I don't know, everybody say, well, everybody needs embroidery. You don't sell embroidery. You sell people the results of having the embroidery. Let that one sink in for a second if you hadn't thought about it. You don't sell somebody shirts. You don't sell somebody hats. You sell somebody the results of having the hat. What does the hat do for their business? Does it market them? Does it make them feel a certain way? Does it make their life better? If you're giving people, shirt quotes for their family reunion, it's not because they can't cover their bodies without those shirts. They have other shirts. The shirt is going to make the family feel closer together. The shirt is going to make them feel a thing. It's going to make the event better. You're selling the effects of the thing. And so honestly, you have to be able to target a particular person, because you can't target the feeling of family togetherness to a large corporate business who's doing gifts. It's just not necessarily the same. Yes, you might. It might be a little closer. That might work out. But let's say you can't target top of mind awareness and marketing to a family who's going somewhere, because they're probably not trying to market that their family is having a reunion to other people. They're not trying to do an awareness campaign for their family, unless I don't know, influencers out there these days. Maybe they are. Maybe they are. But that's just how it is, guys. Mike says, I want 100% of my customers to be the current 20% that generate 80% of my revenue. That is a very weird way to go Pareto principle on us, but yeah, I'll go for it. Yes, a lot of people are spending 80% of their time on like 20% of their revenue. And that is really truthfully the case. And yeah, Mike says, trademark that, Brian. So apparently TTG, he likes that one, thread to garment. And Christine says, preach, Eric, preach. It's so true. You can serve everyone, but you can't use a one size fits all marketing pitch. You have to target specific groups. You can't stand out with a pitch that says we are like all the rest. We can do what everyone can do. That's just not what it is. Plus, good embroidery and solid customer service are the entry level. That is the entry level of what you have to do. Standing apart is about what you can do differently. It is expected that you provide a good product, and it is expected by far that you are able to be decent to your customers. That is the barrier of entry. You can't even be in the business selling unless you can provide a product that's worthwhile and you are decent to your customers. That's like, you're not getting an award for a thing you were supposed to have done. It's kind of the hard way of putting it, but it's true. All right, folks. So let's get back into it. What we started with here, I want to talk about machines in production. So let's actually get to some of these assumptions, and they cause problems. And the funny thing is, Brian jumped the gun on me here. Embroidery machines equal thread printers. This is the first one that people have problems with. I know you guys don't need to be told this one, but I'll just reiterate that. I cannot tell you how many times I have somebody come in, especially if they come from the digital printing world first. They jump in and say, okay, I know what I have to do. It's like a printer. I get a file, I load up the garment, I say go, and the file does the thing. And embroidery just isn't like that. There are stabilizers and adjustments on the machines. Now, I know that there are adjustments and things you have to do to other machines. In my opinion, to my current level of experience, printing for me, heat press for me has been a lot less work, a lot less adjustment. You don't do the number of adjustments on a heat press that you do to an embroidery machine, by no means. Tension means nothing to that. I mean, we have temperature and pressure over here. The amount of things we can change about the stack of both stabilizers and whatever else goes in to the stack of hooped materials that make up an embroidered blank, let alone all the things that we can change, especially if we're digitizing ourselves. There's a lot more. There are a ton of moving parts. There are a ton of variables, literal moving parts and variables that have to be accounted for embroidery to turn out well. If you think this will be like pressing print, that you just have to have the right file in to get the right thing out, yes, the file matters. We'll talk about that more, but this is not a thread printer. Embroidery is a very different thing, and the material interacting with all of these things together, including the machine, including tensions and everything else, can make a big difference. Embroidery machines are not thread printers. That's just what I'm going to say, flat out. And that's the first thing that I have problems with when people come to embroidery. If they're not lovers of embroidery who want to get into the business, if there are people who are just seeing a need for embroidery in their area who then want to serve that need, but they're not garment people, they're not embroidery people, they're not sewing people, they come in thinking, I buy the machine, I put the shirt on the machine, I get the file from somewhere, and off it goes. And it's just not necessarily the case. So yeah, that's the first thing. Second thing is really about people who are upgrading, and this is absolutely the truth. Absolutely the truth. Um, Everybody will come to this thing at some point. Somebody will tell them, all right, I have my single head machine and I've been working my way up, and now I have enough money for, I'm getting close to enough money for a multi-head. I have more stuff coming in. I'm going to sell my single head machine and buy a multi-head machine. Every time I see that, I kind of want to give people the caution light. Really depends on what you're doing. Once again, pros and cons for your own context. Depends on what you're selling, depends on what kind of part of the business you're getting into. I ran multi-head machines primarily first and foremost in my career, but multi-head machines are not inherently better than single head machines. Multiple single heads can be used to fulfill the same kind of orders you would have on a multi-head machine. Certainly costs more to work with them to a degree. At the same time, if what you do is highly individualized orders with individual names, if what you do are single piece orders, very small orders that are varied, lots of small, highly personalized orders that have higher margin, a fleet of single heads may make more sense to you. And even if you are a shop that is a larger shop or trying to be a larger shop that does lots of runs where you're going to do the same thing repeatedly, having a single head machine on hand for sampling, for small run orders, and for personalization is still incredibly valuable, even when you're a multi head shop, even in a multi-head shop. So I always try and suggest to people to keep that single head if you can. Multi-head machines are not inherently better. It doesn't make you a better, bigger, greater embroiderer to use a multi-head versus singles. I think the thing is, you really have to know what fits for your shop. Multi-head machines are great for production, and especially if you're doing things that have larger, more homogeneous orders. And let's say you're someone who has your own line. Let's say your production is actually for your own line where you're controlling the art and you're stocking garments. If you're stocking garments, I can imagine you say, hey, man, I just want to do multi-head production. I know what's going on and I'm selecting the number of pieces myself. I'm not going to have a lot of empty heads sitting around at any given time. Awesome. Multi-head machines all the way. That sounds great. You're doing large contract. Awesome. Multi-head machines all the way. But it doesn't make them inherently better than running multiple singles. And it definitely doesn't mean that you're upgrading. Selling off the single and getting a multi, by all means, hold on to that single if you can afford it. If there's any way for you to do that and keep your production up, hold on to that single head machine. It is so useful to have smaller machines when you need to do smaller orders, and especially if you're doing development. And like I said, gift stuff, boutique stuff, personalization, being able to shift certain things to a single head machine, or let's say if you're in the kind of situations I was in, multiple multi-head machines with a couple of single heads lets me fill in a piece when I have to, lets me sample while I'm running the multi to keep orders moving, allows that to happen. So that's how it is. That's how it is. It does not mean 100% that I would say you never move straight to the multis, but every time I see somebody who's just getting to a certain size and like, I'm selling my single head and getting a 6 head, I always want to, caution, hold on to that one if you can. If there's any way for you to just pick up that pick up that payment without losing that single, I always think it's a better option. At least it makes you much more versatile. It makes you much more versatile in the long term. So I think that's a useful thing, and I kind of try and get people going. I'm gonna grab a couple comments because there's good ones going on here today. Christine says, "Yeah, do good work, and we don't treat you like crap are not selling propositions, although some companies seem to think they are." Yeah, it's not enough to stand apart. Certainly, that's for sure. Cindy's making deliveries and listening. Thank you for checking in, and thank you for keeping the industry moving. Make those deliveries, keep those needles moving, and never feel bad about not paying full rapt attention to the screen. Sally says, I have a collection of sewing machines. I can never bring myself to sell what I upgrade. That's harder. That's when you're being a collector. That was like me with the old Brother machines I had when Brother commercials stopped being released. And it was hard to let those go because I loved those little things. Mike says, multi-head is its own set of problems and benefits. A well-rounded shop could easily have a couple of both multi and single. This right here, comment of the day, as far as I'm concerned. For me, the best mix is a couple of multi heads, depending on your size. Could be a couple of eights, could be a couple of 12s, or a 6 and a 12. It could be a different mix of multi heads, but a couple of multi heads and a couple of singles makes a nice, well-rounded mid-size kind of local shop, and I really enjoy the abilities you get with that. Couple of multis, couple of singles makes a lot of possibilities. It makes a lot of possibilities uh, for you to take advantage of jobs coming in, and it also means you can have one single and one multi on hats with one single and one multi on flats, and it means that you can continue rolling with different kinds of orders at all the time. Now, you will have times that volume makes you switch those over, but that switch over cost, it can be painful depending on the kind of machine you have. It can take a lot of time out of your production. So yeah, lots of stuff going on. Mike says, "Love my 12s, but I wish I had a 4 or 6 for the middle volume orders." Yeah, sixes are great for that. Love that. Love that. Um, but Mike says, "With a gun to my head, the single heads stay and the multis go." It's yeah, I know it's hard because I'm a multi-head guy. Started out on the first machines I ran. Well, okay, second machines. We had a couple of old Milkos that were smaller, but the machines that I ran when I was really getting my steam as an operator were 12 head Tajimas. Ran a couple of them, so I ran 24 heads sometimes at a time. Sometimes I was able to have help and I could run one of the 12s by myself. But 12 heads were great. We ran them all the time. What I'm going to tell you was sampling on the 12 heads, where I've got 11 heads that are still driving the Takeup levers, even though I've got them all clamped off. And so they're kicking the thread around and roughing the thread up while I'm running one head, was horrible. It was always horrible, and invariably I ended up unthreading some needles and having to go back down the row and work on things. They come with their own problems. They're not great for sampling. It's not the best thing you can do. But that's how it is. Susan says, I have a 6 and a 15 needle, end up using the 6 needle more than the other. I have a flatbed single needle, but it has limits. Flatbed home style machines have a lot of limits. Doesn't mean you can't do stuff on them that's useful, but it is for sure. Uh, there's a difference between between multi needles certainly and what we call like a cylinder arm type machine versus a flatbed machine. Certainly fully home style flatbed machines, a lot of production is going to be hard to do on those, and I'm going to tell you, for me, multi needle and above, that's where I'm going to go for commercial production. That's me. But I have seen people run them, and I'll also tell you there's a difference between professional and prosumer machines, that people kind of have this kind of attitude toward them, where they think that the prosumer level home style machines, the multi needle home style machines, can't do work that they absolutely can do. And there's reasons why you might want them. So, like I said, there's some different things about that. So, multi head is better than single head. Not all the time. Not all the time. Also, that the best machine equals the best embroidery. That's the other thing, too. I have people just stopping me at trade shows all the time saying, no, just tell me which machine is going to give me the best embroidery. Yes, there are differences in machines. Yes, there's differences to some degree in stitch formation or features that can help you. If you got like the ZSK that I have in my background here, where you can lift and lower the presser feet fairly easily in a mechanical fashion, you have the new Tajimas that do it digitally. Then you can do different things with thicker fabrics and foam that are different than you can do if you can't do that with some of the old machines, where you'd have to do, or where you'd have to do it manually and it's a real pain. Sure. That's context. If I'm going to do 3D foam hats all day, then I need to talk to my machine manufacturer about doing 3D foam hats all day. I should know that. That's something about my context that I need to know. However, there's so many other things that go into embroidery. Sometimes people come to me talking about their embroidery problems, and after I'm done talking to them, they think they need a new machine to fix the problems. The chances are, especially when they tell me they have one of the big 3 or 4 machine manufacturers that I know work for quite well, either the machine's in poor repair, no matter what kind of brand it is, or they're having problems with execution, with materials, with digitizing that have nothing to do with the machine, and that buying a new machine is a band-aid they want to stick on a problem, that they're honestly trying to treat that symptom and they're not going to treat it. They're thinking that if I just spend more money or just find a new brand, that it's going to stop a holistic problem with all of these different inputs from happening, and it's just not going to happen. So best machine doesn't always equal the best embroidery. Same thing with most expensive. Same thing in the software world. Having the best or having the most recommended thing of any category doesn't necessarily mean you will have the best embroidery, because there's a skill set involved in the middle of all that. Whether it's about knowing the type of materials to use or how to hoop, or dealing with the kinds of materials that you're going to be dealing with as far as texture and stretch and consistency in the garment themselves, there are things you have to know about embroidery that go into your execution that aren't about the machine being a bad or good machine. It is, however, I also kind of recommend people not necessarily get, let's say, well loved used machines for their first go around if they're trying to learn all this stuff, because sometimes you might be working on machine limitations that have more to do with the age and repair of your machine than they do with your ability to understand this stuff or you're digitizing. It can be a difficulty. I know, because I've worked on some pretty rough machines. It really is often something else that's causing the problem. So when someone says, what machine makes the best embroidery? And I'm going to say the well-maintained one that has somebody who knows what they're doing behind the big red button, and that has a decent digitizer working toward making the files. That's the one that's going to do best for you. And it's kind of the same thing with everything. It really just depends. It really just depends for you. It's how it is. So it's just how it is. You have to look at the holistic nature of the thing. And you have to look at context. The other thing is this too: that a commercial machine is always going to be better than a prosumer level or a home style machine. There are some instances in which people have chosen to stay with prosumer machines, and I can fully understand and support it. Don't get me wrong. Like I said, I like the big iron. I'm somebody who wants to run a big commercial machine. I like the really large areas that I can stitch, and I like running fast. Also, for me, I'm not expecting it to understand my hoop sizes. I'm not expecting it to stop me from crashing a hoop, to do alignment tricks, to do any of the stuff that tends to come on the prosumer machines. But I'm also an embroiderer who worked on these and learned on these from the get go. Also, most of the time, the kind of shops I worked in and the kind of instances I would run in, I'm not expecting to move these machines a lot. I'm going to put them in place, lock down the feet, and I'm good. If you were someone like a mobile embroiderer, you might want a lighter machine for that reason. If you're someone who lives somewhere where it's hard to get a tech, but you do have sew and vac shops and you can drop the machine off to have them send it back to the people who made it to fix it, you might decide that you want to go with that prosumer level machine because you know you can hand it off to somebody and have them send it off to be repaired in a way that you might not be able to do with your commercial level machine. There are reasons why you might select the prosumer machine. I'm going to default commercial because of the capabilities that are involved. But and I believe a coworker of mine, Jim, talked about when he managed a shop that was selling kind of prosumer level gear and home level gear. And one of the customers he talked about was someone who was hiking their two single needle prosumer style machines. So it had a cylinder arm, it had a free floating hoop. It was not a table machine, it was a cylindrical style machine. Um, he had this person who was hiking them up into a department store to do personalization and was making money doing that, and went from one to two and upgraded their fleet of these home style single needle but more capable machines, embroidery specific machines that look more like a commercial machine, but these ones were single needle, the ones they were talking about. And part of the reason was you can fit them in the back of your SUV, and you can drag them up the stairs without killing them, and it was easy enough to move them up there. And what were they doing? Single color, simple embroidery, single color names, personalization, context. Context makes a big difference. There are reasons why people might select that. Trust me, the kind of work that I did before and used to do, it would not make sense whatsoever for me to have that kind of machine. That machine would not make sense for me. Hey, in the home office for fun, why not? Maybe we do that for doing some small stuff like that. Maybe, why not? Depends, especially if I'm doing mobile names. Why not? I might think about it, but that's the thing. Hearing that story helped turn me around to why you might not always select to have a commercial machine. I think about hauling the kinds of machines that I used to run, even the single heads, and having to go upstairs with them, and that was definitely never going to happen. The concept that you could bring a capable enough, if a little slower machine up a set of stairs and be able to personalize in a location that nobody else could might be something that adds to your abilities. But it's all about context. Most of us who are in traditional style shops, or even in the third bedroom or garage style shops where we're at our home locations, whether you're doing that or you're in a commercial shop, the likelihood is you're going to go commercial. But what I'm going to say is, it doesn't mean that the person with the prosumer machine cannot do work that is commensurate, that is close to what we're doing, and that there might not be a reason, or at least an instance in which it makes sense to have those machines. So once again, you shouldn't, and by no means should you be made to feel bad if you started on a prosumer machine and you're now looking to work in the commercial world. People shouldn't be looking down their nose at your prosumer machine. People sometimes do, but it's a really weird way to do it. So it's just the way it is. You got to think about it. And Mike says, best is a dubious word. Best for me might not be best for you. That's context all over the place. Though Sally does make a point here that I think is worth mentioning for sure. I've run a single needle flatbed machine for years, but it's very limiting and not good for time management. Got a ZSK coming in the autumn. Can't wait. Yeah, lovely machines. They do a lot of work and they do it very fast and very efficiently. Honestly, you're putting out volume. If volume is what you need, a faster machine that's really stable and can do a lot and doesn't cause you to, especially with the single needle machines, change out thread for every color, is going to be better for you almost entirely. But there are reasons why every once in a while some people are willing to do that stuff. So it just depends. It just depends. So, like Mike said, best isn't best for everybody. And Brian says, I don't golf, but I know the more expensive club won't improve the swing. That is a really good way to put it, Brian. Absolutely. So, just because you get the quote unquote best that someone told you is the thing you need to have doesn't mean you're going to be better off for sure. Mike says, an experienced operator can take a cheap/consumer machine and make it better looking embroidery than someone brand new at the most expensive one available. Yes. If you don't know what you're doing, that will show. And Lizzie says, as much as I've always wanted a big commercial machine, I've stuck with my single and multi-needle brother machines so that I can stitch on machines most similar to what my customers are stitching on. That is context. If you're a digitizer who is selling into the home market and you stitch out everything you do on commercial machines only, the chances are you're going to miss something. I know what people don't know about me, because I do work for people in the home industry. I have a brother machine. I have got a little bitty 800, PE 800, like bottom of the line, the kind of machine you can buy from Walmart.com. And I run stuff on it sometimes. Why? Because it doesn't act like the ZSK. It doesn't act the same way. And if I'm making something for that market, I need to know what's going to happen on their machine. Context is everything. Sally says, I don't need volume, particularly speed, but not having to do constant color changes and babysit the machine would be great. Hey, there's still some babysitting involved, but color changes are a thing. And Mike says, no different than the learning curve. My first stitch out of my first Tajima was garbage. The machine is only a part of it. Me too. The first stitch outs I did on those old Melco machines were not fun. They were not fun. All right. So that's how that is. Like I said, um, we all know in that machine area that just throwing money at it, or that any one type of machine, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have the best embroidery. I think that's fair. One of the other things I just want to mention briefly, jigs, tools, and aids. I've had people come down on both sides of this 100%. Either there's no way you could ever embroider without a hoop master, or hoop masters are expensive and who needs them? I'm building all my own jigs. There is a nice happy medium here. I love the hoop masters. I'm the kind of person who would definitely want one of those if I can. But I started out my career building my own jigs, wooden shirt boards, building your own jigs to hold the hoop backs. Invariably, jigs, I think, are incredibly helpful. Repeatability is important, especially in commercial embroidery. We're doing hundreds or thousands of pieces. That you want to have these jigs and tools and alignment tools and other kinds of aids to make your job better, to make it more consistent. However, you totally can use the table. My first work was done on spectacle machines, and I did lots of those spectacle frames that just pop into the hoop, and you had to kind of align yourself. And a lot of that, even though we did have some jigs that we made, a lot of that was done flat on the table. Almost all of my jacket back work in my career was done flat on the table, because originally we didn't really have great hoops for jackets, and we didn't have great jigs to help that alignment all the time. And on really large jacket backs, I used to just do them flat on the table, because that's how I learned when I started, and I was faster that way than trying to set up the jig sometimes. Once we finally did get the jigs, it does get better. But originally, most of our jigs were for left chest, right chest type of work, whereas a lot of the stuff I did, big flat pieces, were flat on the table. Jigs, tools, and aids absolutely will make your work more repeatable. And what I'm going to tell you is that all uh, not all execution that you need to do will have a ready-made jig you can get, even if you do have the money to throw at it. Sometimes you are stuck making your own solutions. What I will say is I recommend them. I recommend things like the Hoop Master, things like that, and without just saying it's a brand. I don't have a particular brand in mind. If there's other versions of the jigs that you like better, or if there's home versions that aren't the Hoop Master, jigs that help you with alignment on sizing, that make your alignment not only repeatable, but you can record it so that if you have a repeat order from someone, you can do it the same way a second time. Super useful, make you look professional, help you to adjust and help you to get there, especially if you're just starting out. You kind of have a bit of a basis on where something should go without having to worry too much about all of the rules of how to align things and how to get them straight on the shirt. As long as you get that thing straight on the jig and you've got your hoop where it should be, you're likely to be able to do things. And also, jigs, hooping jigs, if we are talking about magnetic hoops, I think you need them because those hoops snap together from space. Like, if you're trying to do a flat work with a magnetic hoop, if you've done it before, especially with the stronger magnetic hoops, you know what I'm talking about. It's a lot easier if you get this thing on a jig before you do it. So jigs, tools, and aids, yes, I think they're quite useful. You may not need a full complement of everything, but this is context again. If you know that the kind of work you're doing is going to have a lot of polo shirts and woven shirts with left chest work, very classic left chest, right chest work, a standard Hoopmaster board with your most used hoop size in the jigs, very useful to you, and I would recommend you use it. But I fully understand if you start your career not using jigs. I mean, it's just how it is. It is something that is hard to do, I think, for people who don't know, but still. By the way, couldn't help but laugh. I usually am not one who laughs in the comments, but this is true because I have video of it. I was there when it got delivered. Our ZSK is portable if you know a crane operator. We had to have ours lifted up onto the roof to get it into the Embrilliance shop. So yes, uh, if you have a crane operator who comes around with you, any machine is portable. But yeah, it is one of those things. And Brian says, show of hands, did you ever try and make your own jig, hooper, etc.? I know I have. Absolutely, show of hands. I have made my own jig for sure. So that's just how it is. That's something that you sometimes have to make your own jigs, and it makes sense. Mike says, I haven't, but I did inherit some homemade woods. A couple of machines, haven't used them. Can't bring myself to throw them out either. Yeah, the craftsmanship is hard to deny sometimes. You feel that history, right? All right, so let's get into some digitizing stuff. Like I said, this may be a two-parter because I have business stuff and other things I want to talk about, but we'll try not to dwell too much on everything. This is stuff that I know you folks know, by the way, because you're on this channel. If you've been here before, you know about digitizing. But let's talk about some of the assumptions people make in digitizing that hang them up and cause problems. The number one absolute problem is this one: digitizing equals conversion. If you are out here and you are just brand new to this industry and you have gotten this far into this broadcast, by all means, let me disabuse you of the notion that you are going to take a JPEG or a PNG file or even an EPS or SVG file, plug it into some software, click a button, and have the best embroidery possible, or even probably good embroidery, without any sort of editing, without any sort of oversight, without knowing what you're doing. The best you can probably hope for is fairly mediocre results from complete and total auto digitizing. I know, because this is the first thing I know you guys were going to say. Eric's going to talk about auto digitizing. Yes, I am. Of course I am. I can't help that. It's just something that I bring up all the time. Things have changed. It has gotten better to a degree in some softwares, but ultimately, I showed this slide for a reason. Auto digitizing on this shape got me these results with some tweaking. Uh, this is the original. This is what I ended up with. Digitizers can see shapes and draw things that are not there. We can make decisions about stitch types that are related to the art that's there. We see potential, computers see shapes, and they just try and fill them as best they can with stitches in accordance to some rules about what sorts of shapes and areas can be filled. It doesn't mean there's no possibility for it to get better. It doesn't mean that AI won't come along someday and analyze all the digitizing work that's ever been done and come up with a better solution. We have computing power that's like this. It's not being used right now in software. Most of the time, what it's doing is looking at the shape. It's saying across this area, we have this kind of distance, and that distance or this size of the area is something that we can apply a satin stitch to or a fill stitch to according to these rules. And it is not definitely doing anything that is related to art. It's not looking at the image and saying, here is a wing, here is a claw, here is a tail. It's just saying, I have a shape that is this many millimeters across. What can I do with it? Auto digitizing right now is just even great auto digitizing is probably not going to be the thing that's going to remove your need for oversight from the process. That's the one thing. Digitizing is not going to be conversion. Auto digitizing is not a complete solution. It doesn't necessarily mean that auto digitizing doesn't have a place. It definitely doesn't mean that automated tools that aren't about the creative process, that don't just smash a graphic through them, aren't useful. They absolutely are. Automated tools that make things easier are absolutely useful. Full auto conversion from a graphic to a file will result in something that requires editing, very likely. So that's it. And I'm going to say, with even using multiple different packages, I've never seen one where I trusted it entirely. And I definitely haven't seen one that does things that are more artistic. I showed you a silhouette, and the silhouette is a super simple thing, because what people say is, hey, you can always use it for simple work. Certain things, yes. Other things, no. Even when you talk about true type, automatic true type conversion to fonts, you never know when the source art is going to trip it up. And so, like I said, there are different ways you can do it. You can get better results out of certain things. Some art is better than other art, but here's the real key. I'm not saying that there's nothing it can ever do. What I'm saying is, people assume that conversion is going to be the way this goes, and that they can just drop a file in and get good embroidery on the other side. And certainly universally, on any art you put in, no. No. And it's certainly not going to do things like choose artistic patterns. It's not going to work on densities to make things lighter. It's not going to work on compensation for different kinds of materials. You're going to have to add that into the process. And it's certainly not going to do things that are artistic, or do things like reduce detail. I've showed you guys a million times, you're working on something super detailed, and one of the things people do all the time is try and draw every line when there isn't space for every line, especially with things that are shading styles that look like engraving, that have cross hatching. Invariably, they pack too much detail into small areas. Auto digitizing doesn't do things like look at an area and say, I've got too much detail here, I need to remove some of the detail or the lines. It takes the shapes that are there and it converts them. So it has a limited function. For me, it's never been worth it, because most of the stuff I've done auto, I could have done quickly without using auto. So it's one of those things. There are some automations that are useful, but even the automations that are there, you still have to manage them. You still have to look at them. You still have to know what you're doing to make the best use of them. It's just the way it is. It's what you have to do. So, like I said, invariably, there's going to be some work that you have to do to make things work. Conversion isn't the way. The next thing is this. And this is sometimes to their own detriment when it hurts them for no good reason. People assume that digitizers need to be graphic artists, and also, they'll start to digitize on a blank slate and think that that's normal. That what we do is we take a blank image that we've never touched anything on, and that we digitize into our digitizing software without working over something. And that is not the standard way that it's done. And I know this is something that most of you aren't going to think, but I have had this come up a couple times in the last month to great effect, where I've watched somebody say, man, I just can't get this bird to look the way that I want it to. The eagle looks terrible. And I'm like, oh, well, what's your source art look like? And they're like, oh, well, I just start drawing it. And I'm like, if you're not an artist and you start drawing an eagle and you expect that doing it in thread will somehow be different than drawing it on paper, you're wrong. You're drawing from nothing. That means you have to be able to have all the skills an artist has, but you don't have to, because digitizers are not usually necessarily graphic artists. A lot of us have some graphic arts background or develop some graphic arts skills over time, but it doesn't mean that you're necessarily a graphic artist to start. When we talk about how digitizing is done, the stages of creation that I usually teach start with art analysis. What does this mean? Art's being provided for us. Almost always, the art is being provided for us, and we're assessing it for interpretation. We're not doing brand new art. We're analyzing it, we're assessing that art, and then we're checking to see about details that we might need to change, and then we're making alterations. But once again, if we do this, by the way, auto digitizing, once again, not going to work on your gradients for you, not going to, like, there are certain things auto digitizing is not going to do for you, no matter what. Or at least the ones that I've seen. If you guys have a perfect auto digitizer you want to show me, by all means, send me a link. I haven't seen it yet, but suffice it to say, what digitizers do, though, is often it's tracing. Certainly, we do some planning. Here, I've got a printed piece that I'm tracing, drawing on, but most of the time it's like this. I'm working on some letters. I have a picture of the text that I'm working on. I'm tracing images. I'm breaking it down into satin stitches. I'm doing interpretation that's based on what I know about embroidery. I'm putting in my compensation, stuff like that. But the art is usually created beforehand. You can be the graphic artist yourself and create the art. I've got pieces that I've drawn myself, many, especially in the stock design world. I've drawn most of those myself and then gone on to digitize them. But it's fully normal for a digitizer to take other art, do the corrections that need to be done for it to work very well as embroidery, and then to create embroidery to digitize. That is a very normal thing to do. So, it's what it is. That's what people have going on. It's not necessary to be able to draw like a fine artist to become a digitizer. So yeah, it's not that you don't have some background that's interesting. In fact, what I'll say is that when someone says, "Oh, my digitizer is an artist," often I'm like, "Oh, that's great. That means they might know something about line and color values and things that are helpful to the interpretation of the art." But for especially if you're in the corporate world, if you're in the corporate world, the logo world, the chances are you're not going to need to be a full artist in order to create corporate logos in your digitizing software. You have to be a person who understands embroidery and a good tracer. Someone who can control their lines, learn the tools and control your lines. If you know what you need for the embroidery, that's the most important thing. So, like I said, doesn't mean that it can't help you. Art background helps, and I've gone back in my life. I was a full-time commercial digitizer without any art training. I went back and did one college drawing course, admittedly, and then I went back myself and did more training with vector artists and other artists online. Did some color theory work, did other work while I was learning that helped me to become a better interpreter, but at no point was I a full time graphic artist, and I don't claim to be. Have I designed a bunch of stuff for apparel decoration? Yes. Is it as good as a true graphic artist? Probably not. I don't think I will. I won't shake my own hand, pat myself on the back that much. But suffice it to say, yeah, I think that you don't necessarily have to be a graphic artist. And that's the other kind of side of this too, is that graphic artists are somehow better than digitizers at doing certain things. It's a different skill set. Graphic artists are not always better than other people at becoming digitizers either. You do have an awesome skill set in the fact that you can draw shapes using things like Bezier curves and splines, and you know your way around graphic software. That's awesome. Graphic artists can then use that, but if you don't think about the medium of embroidery, the ability to draw a vector isn't enough. It won't get you all the way there. You have to know how embroidery reacts. And there are other mediums that are like this. I mean, I know it's like talking to 3D printers too. You have to know how the machine is going to handle. You have to know how the different materials change in order to put settings together that make sense. In order to change the variables in the software that make the embroidery turn out the way it should, you have to know embroidery. And honestly, most of the time I have a better time training operators with a little bit of art knowledge, a little bit of drawing knowledge to be good digitizers, or at least technically good digitizers whose files work very well on the machine. Those folks are sometimes easier than people who know how to draw a lot of vector but have never touched embroidery and don't know what it is. If they're the kind of people who take instruction really well and know how to learn from instruction, they don't need to get that hands-on experience. Sometimes I can give them some real basic stuff on compensation, stuff like that, that get them up to speed quickly, and then they do take over that kind of speed. But invariably, where the thread, needle, fabric, stabilizer meet is where all of this comes together, and you have to do some of that work and be present for that to absolutely understand well, to get it into your bones, to know what embroidery does. So graphic artists are not necessarily better as digitizers than other people. And in fact, like I said, operators make good digitizers if they have a little bit of an artistic bone and can do a little bit of drawing on digital graphics platforms of some kind, generally vector arts platforms. If you got somebody with a little bit of vinyl skill who's been on an embroidery machine for a couple years, you're going to have a good time, because the likelihood is they can draw some vector, they know what embroidery is, and they know what it does when it hits the machine. They're going to be having a better time than someone who's never touched embroidery at all in understanding the changes that they make on screen that change things uh, in the actual sew out. So some other things that happen that aren't digitizing related too are around kind of the embroidery file formats, and we'll talk about that for sure. Um, just like we talked about conversion, a lot of people think of embroidery file formats, the working files especially, and what I mean by working files are the files that are native to the digitizing software, native to the embroidery software in which the shapes were drawn, right? So the files that are native in Brilliant Stitch Artist, that's going to be a .be file. In Wilcon, it's going to be a .emb file. Depending on what level of pulse you have, there's different file formats for that. POF was the old outline file back in the day when I was doing work on Pulse. OFM for Melco. The thing is, graphics file formats, don't get me wrong. When you try and convert a .ai file, an Illustrator file to CorelDRAW, there are often things that turn out weird, especially things like gradient fills don't turn out great. But like the basic shapes, I can get the basic shapes out of one type of vector and get them into another vector software and probably manipulate them pretty well. If I don't have anything crazy going on, if I'm not using specialty tools, the base vector shapes I'm usually able to get out of the embroidery soft or out of the one vector software into another vector software without too much trouble, or at least without it going haywire. You just really can't. Whereas you can open an AI file in, let's say we've got, if we've got something like we usually talk about, we have Illustrator or Corel Draw, we can usually get something to do some conversion on those, or we can output to something that's more universal, like an SVG or an EPS. As long as we don't have special features running, we're going to be able to open them in other formats, but you're not going to open one of the embroidery file working formats in another software. Almost never. I mean, there's almost no way to do that. When there are possibilities for that, there may be other kinds of processing or conversion, or they're using the stitch file version or something else, but you're not going to grab your OFM file, open it up in Wilcom, and start editing it like you were in the original software. That is not very likely, and it's not happening. And things are actually built in a different way, and the way that it does the stitch processing between the two is not likely going to be something that you translate. Then these are locked to the particular software brands. So when you have a file from one of these formats, generally what you're going to do is have to get a reader or some other kind of app. It may be online, it might be downloadable, it depends. Back in the day, Pulse had Ambassador, Wilcom is TrueSizer, and also in Embrilliance, our Express mode for the platform lets you open up BE files and save off stitch files. But what you're probably going to save out is a stitch file, and you're not going to get the shapes back for editing. Mostly, if you want to edit a shape that is drawn in a digitizing software, you're going to have to be in the original software in order to edit that file. It's just how it is. Are there ways to pull vector shapes out of the files and then regenerate them somewhere else? Yes. Does that make them universal? Absolutely not. Is it common? No. Most of the ways that people do this are fairly bodged together. If you have somebody's original format, original working file, the likelihood is you need to be in that same software in order to edit it again. Does not mean there aren't ways to use it. Doesn't mean you can't output stitch files and use them or import them into your software. But getting back all of the original settings and inclinations and everything else is not the norm whatsoever. Yes, I know there are things we can do around that for sure, but it's not, it's not something that is as cut and dry as with vectors. As like I said, if you have, let's say, Affinity is the one that I often talk about because it's cheap. You can pay for it once. As a vector editor, Affinity Designer will open an AI file and give you something roughly the same as what was created in Illustrator. Not normal for embroidery file formats. And so people who are not used to that, who are in that graphic design world, may get into embroidery and find that they can't convert stuff in there. They end up with 2 or 3 of these either online programs set up, or they have a downloadable, like Paul's Ambassador used to be, or TrueSizer used to be before they became online software. Or they've got, like I said, accounts for all of these, so that when people send them these formats that don't convert, that they can get them down to something that is more universal, at least in the fact that stitch files tend to be convertible. So yes, when we're talking about working file formats, they're not converting easily. You're not editing the original shapes. But of course, stitch file formats, yes, you can convert from different stitch file formats, but you have to remember, depending on the format and the age of the format and the way it's put together, it may or may not have any other data aside from literally the stitches and the stops. Colors may not be saved. As you know, classic DST does not save thread colors. That kind of stuff can trip people up if they don't know it. But yeah, that's just how it is. So let's go with a couple of comments real quick before we go on further. But yeah, it's just one of those things. You have to understand that the native file formats in embroidery usually are locked entirely to the software that they come from. So, it depends. Mike says, I can't draw to save my life, but I can outcad many and am lower mediocre at digitizing, slow, not an artist, not even a little bit. Well, yeah, that can be the case. But here's the other thing. There's another assumption that I didn't necessarily put in here to talk about, or, I thought I would touch on. You don't have to be a digitizer to be an embroiderer. Tons of embroiderers never digitize or hire out almost all their digitizing, and that is not a problem. I've known somebody who's been in business for more than 30 years, making lots of money with lots of great clients, and she hires out every bit of her digitizing, has never touched it. I mean, I don't know that I could stand myself not having the ability to control the machines on a basic level, but you can absolutely, especially if you have a relationship with good digitizers or you have a nice wide base of digitizers to work with, you absolutely can run an embroidery shop without digitizing. Caveat on that, I think every shop should absolutely have lettering and editing software. Every single shop, you should not be waiting around to drop a name. Lettering software is something I would never let a shop go without. editing software. We can do little spice editing or little compensation tricks if you must on something that like has to go out today and you can't talk to a digitizer about it. Absolutely do that, to the point of maybe even having digitizing software in-house to do editing, and especially working with a digitizer who uses the same software you do. That's great. Those are great things you can do. A little bit of editing is good for everybody, but if you don't want to do heavily artistic digitizing, but you need artistic digitizing done for you, that doesn't put you out of the range. As an embroiderer, you don't have to digitize yourself. You don't have to, and it doesn't always make sense to. We'll talk about that. And Brian says, regardless of your art background, you need to watch tons of embroidery happen in order to understand what you're doing. I think that's true. I think that's true. Tad says, I was discouraged as a kid to pursue art because I'm colorblind. I made a living primarily as a digitizer from 1991 to 2018. Listen to that. Tad knows what he's talking about, and he knows what he's doing. You can digitize without it. You can digitize without that necessary art background. Do you learn a bunch of stuff? Absolutely, you do. But a lot of it, especially if you're somebody who starts in production, Tad actually, to continue his story, and this is very much like my story, I spent my first 5 years in braided production, learned digitizing at the same time. Can't imagine a better way to get an understanding of digitizing. Absolutely. I ended up being the full-time digitizer at my shop very early. I didn't spend years. I was digitizing within months of becoming a full-time operator. But throughout that process, I kept refining, and I got there quickly because I was running my own designs as well as designs from people who are really good at digitizing. Running well-made designs will teach you a lot. And honestly, running your own bad designs will teach you a lot too. There's nothing like the pain of failing on your own work, because it will absolutely teach you very quickly what works and what doesn't work. And as Cindy says, for me, it's a time thing. I can digitize some, but I'm busy running the machines. And that is the right way. If you don't have that space, or if you don't make the market for digitizing yourself, there's really no reason that you have to do it, and it might not make sense to you. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead because I think we probably won't get to all these assumptions I want to talk about today. But I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Certainly, we have a couple things that I just will very briefly hit. That you can make one embroidery file for all applications. That's an assumption that people have. I'm going to make one file that kind of fits on a hat and a shirt, and it's going to work for everything. Absolutely not. You will find certain hats, certain shirts, certain jackets, toweling, thick stuff, especially super thin stuff, where you have to make adjustments to make things work, to make them register, to make them light enough to be tolerable on the particular garment, to make them heavy enough to cover on the particular texture. One embroidery file will not necessarily work for all applications. Yes, there's some luck you can have with adding a knockdown stitch. Like if you're someone in our camp who's got enthusiast, you can add one. If you're digitizing your own light mesh fill, you can do that in any digitizing software. Whatever feature you have that's similar to that, you can use things to make things work on like toweling and textures. But going the other direction, let's say you have a nice heavy file that you now want to work on a tissue tee. Yeah, that probably is not going to work real well. You're going to have to do some editing to make that even possible whatsoever. And if you're trying to make something center out that is not centered out, and you've got a very cantankerous hat that you can't glue down, stick down, stitch down, or otherwise tame, the chances are you have to have two files to make that work. Sadly, a lot of people think they're going to send away that digitized once, and that's the end, and it is not the case. The other thing, this is the one that kills all the people who try to digitize. If something looks perfect on screen, it's going to look perfect on the machine. No, absolutely not. It's absolutely the other way around. If you make it look too perfect on the screen without doing the compensations you need to do for the actual tensions and distortion that embroidery is always under, no matter what, it may vary in how much, but embroidery always distorts. You will have problems. You will have distortion at the machine. Perfect on screen always means distorted at the machine, whereas meaningful, purposeful distortion on screen means perfection on the machine, like Brian always says. So suffice it to say, something I've always taught is that the screen is lying to you. Trusting the screen is the first way to end up with bad embroidery. Whatever is on the screen is very unlikely to be what you end up with. Only the embroidery matters. You've been around here, you know how I feel about that. The screen is not your friend. The preview is not your friend. Nothing matters but the stitches. You are not a file maker. You are an embroidery maker. Even as a digitizer who may not be running their own machines, your produce is good embroidery. Your produce is not the file. It is a step in the road. It's a step in the right direction, but it is only a waypoint. And only when that thread hits and only when it gets pulled out of the hoop is this thing actually done and is the product actually made. So that's a big deal. I mean, like I said, it's something I always have to say. And yeah, Lindsay's right. Circles and eggs. Make circles on screen, get eggs on the machine. That's how it works. You want a perfect circle, it better not be perfect on that screen for sure. And I like what Mike says. Oh, yes, you can only learn to make good embroidery from making bad embroidery. Yeah, there's the eggs you got to crack to make this omelet. If you make great stuff right off the bat, you got lucky. And I'll say this, until you make a mistake, if you haven't pushed yourself hard enough to make a mistake, the chances are you're not learning, you're not pushing yourself hard enough. You're lucky, and you may be doing things that don't need to be done to get to your result. Or even if it looks good, you might get a better result if you push yourself a little harder, you dropped out some more density, you use some different underlay. You might find an even better result than the okay result that you lucked out and got on the first stop. And yeah, Ramona says, I always get the letters aren't straight across on screen. Yeah, top lines and base lines on screen will never be perfect. And if they are perfect, the chances are they're going to be funky camel humps on the machine. That is just how that works. A couple other things I wanted to talk about in the digitizing side of this. This is one that's going to hurt me because I was an in-house digitizer. The assumption that in-house digitizing saves money. Here's where I call myself out to a little degree, and here's where I call some other people out lately who I've seen in the marketing space. There are people right now selling you software by saying that it is a money saver primarily. That's the reason why we should digitize in-house. I'm going to argue that it is, though it might be the case, you might save money. Let's say you have someone you're paying no matter what, and they don't have all their time utilized, and they use their underutilized time to become a digitizer. Then in-house digitizing saves you money, potentially. If they're good, if they're not spending a lot of time doing editing, and if it's easy enough or you've got enough work to amortize the cost of software setup, their workstation and getting underway and education, the time it takes for them to learn, even if you're not paying for education itself, the time it takes for them to learn and get good enough to do it commercially, if you can absorb all that, then maybe in-house digitizing to save money is a great idea for you. I think there are wonderful reasons to digitize in-house. This is not the top one. This is the bottom rung reason to digitize in-house. Digitizing yourself is best for, in my opinion, and take it with how many grains of salt you require. As I was an in-house digitizer, as you know, best reasons to do it: creative control and the ability to make creative decisions in-house so you can do things that are not normal to the rest of the industry, that are not commodity work. You can make your own experimental treatments. You can do interesting stuff that looks different. That puts you in a different market and allows you to develop solutions for things that are difficult. Quick turnaround. People who absolutely must go from their art to a digitized file same day and potentially be a part of that. You have to consult with them to help them get where they need to go, and you need to do it quickly. Also, that's part of the creative thing, creative consulting, people who are willing to pay, customers who are willing to pay for you to consult and help them in-house to create creative and or other utilitarian solutions that require control in-house. Third one, production control. If for some reason you need to do specialty things in production that are hard to explain to a digitizer, you can't get a digitizer to do, or you're trying to develop new methods of making or making marks that are not what they are used to doing, being able to develop and work on that in-house can make it quicker and can make things that are unique and unique to your shop. These are good reasons. Creative reasons, technical reasons, reasons of speed and fulfillment, creative control, technical control. Those are really good reasons. You guys know I did a lot of work for film and TV. We could not have done same day turnaround for shooting schedules as easily, at least, without someone in-house to handle the creative work and to work with the teams that had to be worked with in order to get this stuff done. Can you have a digitizer who has a super quick turnaround make this possible? You can. You lose a lot of control, and certainly a lot of what I did was interpretation and discussing things with the people in the other side of the creative, in the background of the TV and the movie kind of industry. When I was doing that discussion and that work, that's part of the value. So can it save money? Maybe. You can turn it into a profit center if people value what you do, your consultation, your creativity enough to pay enough to make it make sense. You can also create things that help you to stand out, and having an in-house digitizer and the ability to work with your production crew specifically and your specific equipment means that they can make solutions quickly, also understanding the context of your shop. But just the concept of, I'm tired of paying that guy $5 to $15 for a left chest, that is probably not the best reason to get into in-house digitizing, especially if you find you're a solopreneur or a small shop and all of your people have enough work to do every day. The chances are, if they have enough work to do every day and doing production without digitizing being added to it, you're going to move someone from one task over to digitizing, and they will not be there to do the task they were doing in the first place. Depends how much you're spending on digitizing, depends on what your context is, but this is probably the worst reason people take on digitizing. I think everybody should have digitizing software 100%. I think everybody who wants to learn it should learn it. I think more people should do some digitizing than currently do. However, if that's not something you want to do, if nobody in your shop is very capable, if you don't have time to add that to your schedule, then the chances of it just saving you money outright to buy some digitizing software and throw someone at it, or someone with a little bit of art background, like we talked about earlier, they may or may not be ready to just jump on this train immediately. You're still going to be outsourcing for a period of time. Be aware that you're going to take time to amortize the cost of the investment. And you're going, depending on the kind of software you have, some software is very expensive. So that may take a much longer time to amortize your costs. Very expensive software has a tendency to do that, right? You just have to pay more money to get them ready. Um, you have that time involved, you have the education involved, and there's an opportunity cost there. I still think in-house digitizing has a massive place in the industry. It can be very useful. However, it has to be used correctly in order to make it profitable. And definitely just the concept that you're saving money from the get-go by switching to in-house absolutely doesn't mean you can do it every time. So that's how it is. Like I said, it's not that I'm saying it's a bad idea, and I'm not trying to call out people who are marketing on that in their software marketing. I am saying this: be aware that someone marketing to you that that's the entire reason why you should get it is to save money. They need to turn around and look at what those costs are and how long it's going to take you to get to that final kind of amortization point and to the profit point. Not enough of us are using it, especially if you're using it as a loss leader. You're not having your customers pay for it. Adding the extra cost of having someone in-house in the States learn a task and be an employee may not be what you think it is as far as trying to make that money. Like I said, everyone should have the software, in my opinion. Certainly, everybody has to have lettering software and be able to do their own lettering and editing. But I would say not everybody is intended to be a digitizer. You don't need to be. But even if you do want to bring it in, realize that it's not necessarily a money saver, but you can absolutely make it into a money maker. And that's the real thing, is to understand that. I super advocate, like I said, I always advocate for anybody who wants to learn digitizing to learn it. I want people to, however, kind of get the idea ahead of time that the reason to take it in-house shouldn't necessarily just be to save money. Have the software, learn how to use it when you can. Understand that you're not immediately saving money when you turn on the switch on the computer the first day with that software in it. So it really depends. Like I said, there are things you need to learn. I think more people should digitize than do, but the reasons why they choose to do it kind of make me crazy sometimes. Let's go over a couple more, and then I think we're going to leave some of this stuff till later. So we're getting into the business side, and we'll go a little rapid fire in the business side, and then we will call it a day. So some of the stuff in the business side that drives me nuts, you guys know, this is the big one. $1 per thousand stitches, it's pricing, right? Pricing is always one of the things that drives me nuts. People want to stick with the same price and it's been around for 20 and now maybe 30 years. Prices have changed, costs have changed. We can't always be doing things for $1 per thousand, and not every market makes sense for that. If you're doing fashion work or boutique work or resort work and you're doing crazy amounts of creative on the front end, dollar per thousand work is just not going to make sense for you. That is more of a contract type of work that people are discussing when they say that stuff. And you need to understand your context and the kind of work you're doing. Pricing really doesn't, I think it doesn't have an easy method for every single shop to use the same pricing. People want to sell you the spreadsheet and they're going to tell you it's all just about calculating your costs. Yes, that's part of it. But pricing goes beyond that because people value things differently. Somebody values a t-shirt that's sitting at Disneyland that is officially produced by Disney, and a t-shirt that is sitting somewhere on a boardwalk that is not produced by Disney but has Disney stuff on it. They value those two shirts differently because at one point they're having an experience they want to remember when they're at Disney versus they're somewhere out in the middle of nowhere on the high street and they're buying a Disney-like shirt. The literal position, the person who they're with, the place they're buying it can change the price. Why would you think that all prices should be the same? I think that's one of those problems, right? Invariably, people think that the pricing is going to be just a function of a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet. It isn't always. Do we need to know our numbers? Absolutely, we need to know our numbers. Absolutely, we need to know our numbers, need to know our costs. And like I said, one of the things that people also mess up quite a lot is not paying themselves. Even if you are a solopreneur, you need to pay for yourself, because if you're ever going to hire an employee, you should know separately what that labor is worth to put somebody in the position you're currently doing. Pay yourself for labor, understand your costs, understand all your fixed and variable costs. That is very normal. However, that calculation isn't always the same. And here's the other thing that drives me crazy: the idea that price is locked to costs. Like I just said, the value of an item is what someone is willing to pay for it. That value can change due to positioning, due to marketing. If an influencer shows it to somebody, there are multiple emotional reasons why you could charge more for the same thing in one place than another, in one context than another. Price is not necessarily locked to cost. Whenever I see somebody trying to increase the value that they get back from a customer, increase the prices that they want to charge, the first thing they do is add more cost. They put in more materials, they add more decoration, they want to put in a higher value garment because they're doing markup on the garment, which is not the only way to get this thing done. And so they lock the price to the amount of work that they're doing, the amount of money they're putting in. Price doesn't have to be locked intimately to cost. It doesn't have to be pegged one to the other. Price is not always locked to cost. I know it's funny because people are going to see the thumbnail and see this like I'm saying price is locked to cost, but this is one of the bad assumptions. Um, Honestly, the price is based on the value what someone will pay. People will pay differently depending on the context. You don't necessarily always need to add more stitches, more material, or more time to something to make it worth more. The value can be about how it's marketed, about where it's positioned, about where you're selling it, about who you're selling it to. And I know that sounds funny, like you're making this up on the fly. People make emotional decisions about what something is worth all the time, and it's okay for us to understand that and price things appropriately. Do we really think that the shirts we make for business to business work are markedly that much more different than shirts that we make for a retail shop? Usually, retail stuff often has less stitch count than the stuff we're making for business to business. Go look at home decor. I'm always shocked at how many stitches they consider to cover an area on a pillow in a high-end home store. Um, it's surprising sometimes what they will do. Full density, full coverage, more stitches is not always the thing that people are trying to sell. You could sell a very light stitching garment in a retail context with art that people liked, and that lower number of stitches, that less production time you spent, is still worth more than a commercial logo. And especially, let's say you're selling one person's commercial logo gear to someone else's business that doesn't want that logo on it, that is worth nothing. Obviously, it's context, it's the value of the art, it's the value of the positioning that makes things what they are, as well as cost. So is do we have to calculate our costs? Absolutely we do. Is it pegged entirely to cost? No, it's not. So you don't necessarily have to add more cost for yourself to make things work, right? Uh, Same kind of stuff. In that same vein. When people do that calculation, the other thing people do a lot, and it's not that you don't want to do this to some degree. You want to understand your production potential. And when I teach people to calculate their costs, I do tell them to look at what a full calendar would look like for them. But when people have an expectation of how much money they will make as a decorator by saying, I'm going to run my machine for every hour that I possibly can run my machine, it's really unlikely, especially when you're first starting. So if you're starting a business right now and you're calculating how much money your machine will make by saying it will be full of work from the day you open that machine up and that you will never have any downtime, that is a bad calculation to assume on. You should know how much work you can get done reasonably, but if you calculate what you will definitely be making and expect those, the money to be rolling in at the rate of a completely full calendar, you better be out there selling to make that calendar full. Um, it's worth understanding that that is not always the case. Sometimes when people use calculators, calendars, and spreadsheets, they're calculating based on a full number of hours in production, not based on the number of hours they think they'll actually need to produce. Just something to watch for, not something you necessarily can calculate out that easily, but it's something to remember that you may not be filling every head at all times, which means that if you calculate on full production schedules, you may see something different when you start actually tallying up your money made, your actual efficiencies. So you need to watch that stuff, right? So that's something to think about. A couple other things in the business realm before I close up. People say this, like, if you're going to be professional, you need to be in a commercial space. Not always the case. I have seen lots of back building people who are selling very nice professional work. The level of your work and the cleanliness and quality of your embroidery, even the commercial nature of your equipment, does not have anything to do with the space it's sitting in. And lots of people are running things either from their homes or from outbuildings attached to their homes or attached to their personal property. Professional or commercial embroiderers, if you're commercial, it means you're doing commerce. Are you selling a piece for money and you're making a decent product that is worthwhile and providing customer service? That's commercial. Yes, commercial spaces are interesting. I do always advocate for customer facing spaces. If you have a commercial space and you don't have a place for customers to be that isn't just the dirty corner of a production area, I absolutely advocate for making even a small customer facing space that is more like a showroom or somewhere to sit down comfortably that is not right next to one of the machines running. But it doesn't mean you have to have a fully commercial space or be somewhere in a warehouse in order to be doing commercial work. That's a bias, I think. And I'll say if nobody else learned this during the pandemic, I learned when a lot of the warehouse shops had to shut down and people were still producing from their third bedrooms that there were definite advantages to not being in a commercially zoned building. Certainly, you have to understand whether or not you can work from your home in certain ways, or if you could build an outbuilding. There are localities that aren't going to allow that kind of stuff necessarily, but you can have a full production setup in outbuildings around your home and have more capacity than people who consider themselves commercial embroiderers. Capacity is not the same as where you're putting it. Another big deal, the one-stop shop. I worked in one-stop shops. So I'm not saying you can't make them profitable. You can, but you don't necessarily have to do everything. And taking on more decoration possibilities isn't always going to make your shop better or more profitable. You have to market to the context you're in. And if you see the need, and also always remember, you're paying for equipment, you're paying for skills, and you're paying in opportunity cost, if nothing else, for the education to learn how to use new equipment and to do new skills. Becoming a one-stop shop can be useful, especially if you're in a locality where people want a local immediate pickup or the ability to talk with people, but cannot get that stuff locally. Then awesome. One-stop shop can be a great option if you have people who want lots of different products, but only want to be able to purchase from one person and trust that it all gets done. Either outsourcing and becoming someone who's almost more of an agent for some things. That's something you can do. You can outsource certain parts of your one-stop shop and become that way. That's useful, but you may not want to take on every kind of decoration possible. A lot of it is, it's shiny thing syndrome. You see something shiny and new. It's interesting. If you're a creative person, you might want to do something interesting. So you pick up a bunch more equipment and it's not really fulfilling a need because you feel like you want to do it or because someone asked for it and you feel like you might make some money. Just make sure you're doing the numbers first, run your numbers, see where it makes sense, and understand the costs are not going to immediately be obvious to you, and the opportunity costs are almost never calculated in. Lots of people forget that that means time spent away from something you're already doing. The one-stop shop is not always the best answer. Can it be? Yeah, I worked at one-stop shops, but I'm going to tell you this from the one-stop shop mentality. I have also worked at shops that started out doing everything, and as they sped up and found their efficiencies and the things they were doing best at, or their strengths, the things they could sell on, started to outsource things that made less sense for the team and the equipment that they had. Big one for us was signage. We were doing full color wide format printing. Finally, we started outsourcing it all to somebody who had a printer the size of a building, because the truth of the matter is they could do stuff faster and more efficiently than we could for prices that we couldn't meet on our smaller equipment. We still were making money as the people preparing the art and helping with the design side of that and providing all the decorated apparel. But when it came time to make a giant banner out of that same art, what we did was act as an agent where we prepared the art and worked with the people at the signage shop to have it done. It was delivered to our place, and they got the one stop shop experience of having us handle all of that. And we got to charge a little bit more on the lead end for the work that we did. And they came and picked up everything from one place. Convenience was still there, but it didn't mean that we had to build a new building and have a wall-sized full-color inkjet printer on hand. So, like I said, that's one of the other big ones. Couple quick things just to say. The separation of wholesale, B2B, and retail. You can, as someone who does B2B and wholesale work, have retail fronts. And part of that is this, that one for all branding and marketing. If you have online stores, it's totally fine for the online store to have a different market, brand, logo, and name than the main store of your business, and to have a smaller focus. You can have multiple stores that are marketed to specific people that have marketing that specifically handles their needs, their style, and the messages they want to hear. You don't have to tie everything back to the main brand, and sometimes it makes sense to have different forward facing brands to handle different things. So that's the big stuff. That's it, folks. We covered a lot today. I know you may have to go back and kind of run through the crazy amount of stuff we did today, but I wanted to keep this down to the hour and a half and cut it off straight away once we got there. I know that I've got some stuff I have to do. I wanted to keep it tight, so I kept it as tight as I could and still cover everything I wanted to. But like I said, folks, whenever you have somebody who has these kind of these assumptions built in, who thinks that they know a lot about what's going on, and maybe they do, or they're coming from a different kind of production or a different world, and they're using that and thinking, hey, it's going to be universal. The stuff that I do is really similar to what you guys do in decoration. I'm going to hit the ground running and I know what's going on. Start by thinking, hey, principle of charity. All right, I'm going to take the best version of the thing you said and kind of tell you where I think there's some stuff you might need to know. Principle of humanity. If I came from your background, I might make the same assumptions that you did there. Use those principles first when you're dealing with people, but then help them out with this. Ask what the context is. Hey, what kind of shop are you talking about? Where do you live? Who are you selling to? What kind of market is that? What niche are you in, or what are you trying to achieve? What are your customers trying to achieve? Fitness, do these things fit with that context? Do these decisions you're making fit in that context? And then weigh out the pros and cons. So whether you're having assumptions about machines and production, what machine works best for you, what kind of production methods work best for you, whether you're having issues with digitizing, you kind of have people coming in thinking that other kinds of art styles, other kinds of education are necessary or better. Maybe they don't kind of get the way that digitizing software works, or the economy, or the kind of ecology, the kind of spectrum of different things that come together for digitizing and editing work. Whether they don't get that kind of stuff, or the conversions, or the art that goes into it. Whether you have people, you're talking to people and they have business issues, they kind of don't understand that there's some differences in the way these businesses run, and that not all shops are serving the same clientele. The thing I'll say is, treat them with humanity, treat them with charity, think about the context, and always think about where things fit the best and what you know, and share of yourself if you can, if you have that experience. So with that, folks, I'm going to let that go. There's so much more we could talk about. It's very much like last time. Last week we did the big versus episode where I was talking about versus things that were pitted against each other that really weren't. Those arguments, these assumptions, some of them are correct for certain contexts. But what I'll say is there may be more shows like that coming up. But next week, for all of you folks who want to be here for the technical digitizing stuff, I'm going to talk about specific designs. I'm going to talk about distress designs, and I'm going to discuss different ways that we can achieve it and what you might want to do for those designs. So, digitizing an art next week. Thank you for all being here for this kind of large kind of gathering of the business stuff and assumptions. But whatever you do in this next week, not don't only treat everybody else with some charity. Give yourself some space and grace to deal with your own assumptions. Give yourself some space to learn and grow, and forgive the earlier version of yourself for making some assumptions that didn't pan out. All right, folks, with that, I can't wait to see you again for next week.